All right. Well, we are very pleased to have Dale Batchelor here with us today. I have had the pleasure of hearing her speak, and she is very, very good, and I think we'll enjoy her presentation today. After working 20 years in communications and adult education, Dale drew on her lifelong love of gardening and the knowledge she gained from growing up on a farm in eastern North Carolina to start a second career in the green industry. And she ultimately founded Gardener by Nature, which is a garden design and consultation company that emphasizes native plants and sustainable landscapes. Although she says she rarely meets a plant she doesn't like, her particular passion is plants native to the southeastern United States. And when designing, she believes it's very important to consider not only a site's physical characteristics, but also the existing and surrounding plant and animal communities. She feels that, like many of us do, that a garden is truly alive only when it becomes a healthy, functioning ecosystem. Dale holds a certificate in native plant studies from North Carolina Botanical Gardens, a BA in English literature from UNC Chapel Hill, and a certificate in writing and writing and editing from NC State University. She is a regular contributor to Triangle Gardener magazine, writing about native plants and sustainable gardening. She's also a frequent speaker to garden clubs and master gardener groups. Dale is an active member of several plant and wildlife conservation groups, including the North Carolina Native Plant Society and the Friends of Plant Conservation. Over the past 30 years, Dale and her husband, John Thomas, have created Swiftbrook Gardens, a native plant habitat recognized by the North Carolina Native Plant Society, and it's also a certified National Wildlife Federation backyard habitat. So without further ado, Dale will do her presentation, Doing Less, Getting More, Creating a Sustainable Landscape. Thank you, Dale. I'm going to turn this over to you.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. As I said, technology is definitely not my strong suit, but I'm really excited to be speaking to the Central Coastal Plain chapter of Native Plant Society. And also, I'm a longtime member of our Margaret Reed chapter, which is the chapter that's basically Raleigh, Chapel Hill, Durham, and surrounding area. It seems like from reading in the chat that sometimes I give this talk and I'm trying to convince people what a great thing native plants are and how they should want to have them in their gardens. But I think that's probably not who I'm speaking to today. It's more or less the story of how my husband and I, not intentionally, I wish I could say intentionally, created what I think is a sustainable landscape, a more or less habitat garden. When we moved to our property here, we're in southern Wake County, just south of the NC State agricultural farms in the Lake Wheeler watershed. And the property our house was built on was a tobacco farm until the 1960s. And then I'm sure many of you may be living in former farmland now. But a subdivision was built in the late 70s. We got here in the early 90s. And my husband was the one who was the original person with the vision and dream for our garden. He was had been living on a steep slope and was excited about the fact that we had a flat acre that he could start more or less realizing his dream. He was reading a famous North Carolina gardener and writer, Elizabeth Lawrence, at the time. And Elizabeth Lawrence said that those of us living in North Carolina were blessed because we could have something in bloom 365 days a year. And so that was what my husband set out to do. And these photos are from our backyard. Obviously not in 1992, but some years in. But he really wanted to have something in flower every day of the year. He also was obsessed with hydrangeas. at the time. And I think he had collected 35 forms of hydrangea, one of which was native. None of the others were. But John's dream for our garden was more or less based on his love for English garden writers. And this picture is the White Garden at Sissinghurst Castle in England. So that was the vision that John began with. This is a picture, this is actually probably 10 years old, from our backyard. But this is John's very formal little garden that actually he created behind the tool shed in our backyard. Around 4 or 5 years in, when John was gardening, I wanted to be more involved. Our son was getting older, but it became clear that our little backyard couldn't hold two visions. And so John said, oh, okay, you can have the side yard and the front yard. So this is the side yard that I inherited in the mid 90s. If you look down, that lovely green on the ground is English ivy. I had already been pulling for a time by the time I took this picture. So I had sweet gums pine trees that had all grown back since the land wasn't tilled. If you look in the left side of the picture behind the gas tank, all of those trees are covered in English ivy. And so my first gardening in our property was getting rid of the English ivy. It was full of mosquitoes, just going up the trees, and we knew that wasn't good for the trees. When I pulled all that English ivy, I discovered this little plant growing underneath it. And some of you may have seen this plant. It grows down in the coastal plain as well as in the Piedmont. I didn't know what it was. John said his mother called it turkeyberry. I later found out most North Carolinians would probably call it partridge berry. But this little plant covered just about all of the ground when I would get the English ivy out. It has little white flowers in the spring that smell sweet, almost like almond extract, and then a red fruit that's favored by birds. We actually had a wild turkey in our backyard once, so clearly coming for that. After the partridge berry, about the second spring, we began to notice that we had just a few, not many, but a few pink lady slipper orchids. That this is one of several native orchids, not as common certainly as partridge berry, but a beautiful plant that comes up in mid-spring. By this time, I was getting more hooked on what else. You know, we had sweet gum trees, pine trees, cedar trees, these ground covers. What else might come back? And I began to realize that along with the different plants coming in, we were seeing more wildlife. And I became a member of National Wildlife Federation and certified the garden. And at the same time, I discovered a woman named Sarah Stein. And Sarah Stein wrote several books. The first that I read was My Weeds. And she, in that book, talked about the fact that her father's garden had deteriorated, and she wanted to have a garden that might be able to take care of itself. That idea really appealed to me. I was going through something similar, watching my father's big garden and fruit orchard get beyond him. So creating a garden 30 years ago, I wanted one that really didn't have to depend so much on me. I very early on decided I wasn't going to irrigate beyond just enough to get plants established. And that was a tall order in a dry shade. What you're looking at right now is actually my front yard. more or less as it is now with a few changes. We lost this maple tree, middle of the photo was diseased, and we lost that just this summer. But I decided to focus on plants that could grow in dry shade. I encouraged the moss to come, and that's more or less most of my paths are made of that. Obviously, I wanted a little more. Green is a great color, but like most gardeners, I wanted a little more color than green. And so I started experimenting with native plants that would thrive in the sort of dry shade that I had. And the bed that you see here was very lucky break, was one of the first beds I created. And it just was luck that all of these things tolerated dry shade. The bushy St. John's wort, Hypericum frondosum. We put up in the chat our favorite wildflower, and I put a spring flower up. If we'd been doing this talk in summer, I probably would have said Indian pink, which is just a wonderful woodland plant. The flowers look like jewels. Turk's cap goldenrod. I saw that someone also mentioned goldenrod as a favorite plant. I think I have 5 species growing in our garden now, and definitely one of the best shade tolerant pollinator plants. I also, like a lot of gardeners, wanted a little bit of a sunny border. And so in the front yard, in front of the house, I have what I call my pollinator bed. And here you see some native butterfly weed, the orange flower in front, Liatris, purple spiky flower growing beside that, some cone flowers. It's not exclusively native. I also have some really tough old-fashioned shrub roses that grow in this bed. But again, they're roses that can take it without spraying any sort of chemicals or pesticides. Oops. So those of you who got the handout, this is in it, but more or less just by eliminating pesticides and chemicals, reducing lawn. In our case, in our yard, the folks before us had tried to have a lawn. It really was a bad idea in all of that shade, but the degree that you can reduce lawn or plants that need that kind of irrigation and fertilization in general. So a mow what grows lawn for the kids to play on that doesn't have to be treated with fungicides or constantly fertilized. Yeah, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And then my favorite part of the do less mantra is doing less raking and cutting back and cleaning. When we first came, our property had mostly non-native azaleas, and they were mostly covered with this pest and scale. And we went to the garden center like most gardeners would and said, well, what do we need to do about this? And they handed my husband this bottle of pesticide, which has since been banned, but at the time you got at the local garden center. And he came home and started spraying the lace bugs on the azaleas. And the smell was just so bad that I said, no, we just can't stand to spray this. I wasn't really thinking about what the spray was doing to all the other life in the garden. But we decided, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to give these azaleas some compost and see what happens. What we learned later was that by adding the compost, we strengthened the plants. By having more diversity of plants, more native plants like this goldenrod with the scoliid wasp are the bugs here in this picture. If you see those guys in the garden, that's great because they're predators that prey on things like the lace bug that were eating our azaleas. I learned that there's scientific proof of the fact that the diversity would help with lace bugs from a man named Doug Tallamy. Probably some of you have already read one or more of his books, but his first book, Bringing Nature Home, Tallamy made the case for native plants because only native plants really support our native caterpillars and bugs. And since almost all songbirds rely on insects for feeding their young, if not themselves, we really need plants. We need native plants if we're going to have birds and butterflies. This is an example of rethinking how much lawn you need or what is lawn. This is actually a garden, a client's garden. And at this time we had a native carex lawn in the front of the house. This is near the front entrance. In this case, the lawn is just being used to set off the front door, to set off this maple. It's not really used for walking. So an ornamental carex is a great ground cover. Carexes, unlike lawn, are host plants for a number of species of moths and butterflies. So that's a very easy transition. Since this time, this couple has had 2 little girls, and we've now in the same garden added a non-native, but also low maintenance and sustainable dwarf mondo lawn, because in the back, they do need a place where these girls can kick a soccer ball. This is an in-town garden with another example of a lawn or front yard alternative. This is a narrow little strip in the historic district where the lots are really tiny. And this client has chosen to use a lot of succulents. Some of them are non-native, but they can take that kind of hot heat right up against the sidewalk. This is all south facing. You'll see some orange butterfly weed in there. And I think there's some agastache back in there, a good solid pollinator plant. But another way that you can rethink, just having a tiny scrap of lawn. I said my favorite part about doing less and getting more is the not being so eager to cut back and clean up. This is from my front garden. You see on the right-hand side, it's the egg case for the garden spider. Riding spider is what we grew up calling them down in Duplin County. But these guys are great predators, taking care of the bugs that eat your plants. Our breed chapter had a talk from an entomologist earlier this spring who really made me think for the first time, not just about leaving the stalks in the garden for the spider, but I didn't know how much our native bees, and they're mostly ground bees, depend on the leaf litter for protection through winter. So you've probably heard it's good to let your leaves just fall, good for the plants. It's also good for a lot of native insects and pollinating bees. Those are all the things that you can do just by doing less. But if you would like to do more, then that's pretty easy to do too. I mentioned that my husband wanted something in flower 365 days a year. Well, in deep shade, it just turned out a lot of native plants helped him reach that goal. This is not exactly a North Carolina native. In this picture, it's a Florida flame azalea, but very similar to our native species here in the Piedmont. Well, really, you do have the pinkster bloom as well, and then the coastal azalea. So all of the native azaleas are wonderful garden plants, and you can have one in flower from spring till late summer with the swamp azalea. Again, looking for things that would bloom in the shade. This again were early plants in our garden. Foam flower, which is a great ground cover. Phlox divaricata, woodland phlox, the blue wild sweet williams, celandine poppies, and then down in the bottom, green and gold. All wonderful native plants. This is back in the client's garden that I was showing you just a minute ago. This is another alternative to a front lawn. Here that we have these nice terraces. I tell people you can have things wild if you have a neat box around it. And so this garden with the terraces is a great example of being able to have something wild. Again, this is not 100% native, but largely native planting that stays in flower spring until the very late fall, and is maintainable. That's another issue. This is obviously a pretty large spot, so it does take some maintenance, but we, my husband and I have maintained this garden for a great many years, and most of the time, now that it's more or less established, it gets about 4 hours of maintenance of a month from us. And so that seems to me a reasonable amount. Another thing that has become really an issue here in Raleigh, where we are subdividing lots and building huge homes on tiny little pieces of property, are stormwater and runoff issues. A lot of, for many, many years, the thinking in construction was you collect all the water from the roof and all the water from a property and you send it out into the street. A few years ago, large parts of Chapel Hill went underwater during one of the big storms. And I know on the coast you're having flooding, so we don't have to talk to you about flooding, but that flooding was all just because all of the water was rushing off of property. There were fewer plants to absorb it. And so we encourage people to be mindful about where the water on their property is going. Some people go so far as to create a rain garden. That's not the only way to be mindful, but this is, you saw the earlier picture was a rain garden we did for clients. That was the layout phase. And then this was, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years later, something like that. And it's, again, mostly native hibiscus, some native trees. Another thing that is part of the, if you want to do a little bit more, leaving leaf litter, as I said, is really important for the bees. But also, and this isn't possible with everybody in every town ordinance, but even a small brush pile can create a lot of habitat for birds, just for bunnies and all sorts of animals. This is ours. We happen to have enough of a wooded plot in the background that nobody minds if we have a fairly substantial brush pile back there. And then again, this is our woods, leaf litter, natural paths. All of that is, I was wanting to check the chat and just make sure that I haven't left anybody totally behind here. It's always different doing these talks online instead of in person. I can't read faces to see if I'm leaving you guys behind or not, but
Dale, we did have just one question about
sure.
if you could tell a little bit more about the rain garden and briefly how to install one.
Well, I can send out a link. There's several good books, and the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Service has a detailed book on their website on how to build a backyard rain garden. A rain garden could be something as simple as a swale or depression, and then planting plants in that low place or swale that really absorb a lot of water, and things like this publication from Cooperative Extension Service will spell out things like water good plants for rain gardens. It can also be a very complicated engineered process where you really dig up a lot of soil and you set it up so that the water, rain gardens are really slowing devices more than anything else. It's not that they hold the water for a long time, they simply slow the water down. And so there's usually a place where the water comes in, say maybe ties from the downspouts, but then there's also always a place where the water does drain out, because obviously if it just sat and held water, you'd be breeding mosquitoes. But I think the best answer I have for that is to go to that Cooperative Extension website. Here in Raleigh, at least, there is a city program where the city of Raleigh will actually reimburse part of the expense for creating a rain garden. And so it might be worth looking into your local town and just see if they're doing anything with that.
Okay, thank you, Dale. We did have one more question. Would you prefer I hold these to the end or interject as you go along?
It's really up to you all. I think I'm pretty much on track. The next part I want to show you is just a little bit more about, we got a little bit more overboard with doing less and getting more, or maybe doing more to create.
Well, we did have a question about brush piles.
Okay.
What about the fire hazard aspect? Do you burn this occasionally? I had a brush stick pile, but do plan on burning it eventually. What are your thoughts?
The big pile that you saw me throwing the stick on is a great big pile at the edge of our property, and there is actually a road on the other side of it. And no, we just let that break down, and it's amazing how fast it does break down. We actually also have a very small burn pile that we do some burning, especially because we're still trying to eliminate invasive species. So we have some things that when we pull up, we throw on the burn pile, like honeysuckle. We don't want to put honeysuckle in the brush pile. But yeah, I'd say it would depend on, if it were really close to a structure, you might be worried about fire, but mostly these things just break down in our hot, humid southeastern North Carolina. Does that answer that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. It's this one thing I will say, though, while we're on the subject of leaf litter, is I have learned, and that's actually going to come up, that there is a limit to leaf litter. And mentioning the burning is a good way to segue a little bit more into what I wanted to talk about now. Was I mentioned that I got eagerly interested in the beginning in what would come back if I just ripped out the English ivy, ripped out the honeysuckle, what could come back out of the soil that had spent, who knows, 100+ years as tobacco farm. And this wonderful little plant is marybells. And that was one of the first things that came back. And of course, then the deer immediately ate the marybells once it wasn't covered up in honeysuckle. And so the first management thing I learned I had to do in my woods that I wanted to be wild was spray the things like the marybells with deer spray. Another plant that was back in our woods was running cedar. And we were really excited to have that. That's a plant that was almost exterminated, both for being collected as Christmas decorations and also because the spores, it's related to mosses and ferns, but the spores it produced were used to make flash powder for photography. And so it was heavily harvested. But as I'm getting ahead of myself, I was still thinking that, I would just see all of these things that could come back. The picture that's up now is actually a picture of the Margaret Reed Wildflower Garden. And I mentioned that our chapter here in Raleigh is the Margaret Reed chapter. Margaret was a woman who started in the 1930s as Wake County was being developed and started rescuing plants and planting them in her garden, which is right in the middle of Raleigh off of Dixie Trail, and created the different plant communities that are native to North Carolina. And so I started volunteering at the Reed about 2004 and had thought, well, this is who I want to emulate. A difference was that Margaret's piece of farmland that she planted all of these things in was very rich soil. It hadn't been degraded by a lot of chemicals. Some of the natives had been left there. Some of the azaleas that were in the garden had just been there all along. So there was a big difference between the circumstances I was in a depleted former tobacco field that had been treated with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. Before I leave the picture of the Margaret Reed Garden, that I want to say, if you happen to be in Raleigh on Easter Sunday, the Reed Garden is always open on Easter Sunday afternoon, as well as some other times. But there's information at the Native Plant Society website. This is another Reed Garden picture. This is the floodplain garden, which was one of the habitats that she created. In my own garden, I started adding some things when it looked like I wasn't going to live long enough to see my property repopulate. One of the things, especially pre-pandemic, our native plant chapter did was organize rescues. Just like Margaret, when places were being developed, roads were being built, we go out and rescue plants, share them with public gardens. We've shared plants with the Museum of Art here in Raleigh. And also, though, members take plants home and plant them in their gardens. Trout lily, I rescued on my very first plant outing. And many years later, I still had one clump of trout lily. My soil is dry and acidic. I had one spot where I was able to get May apples to grow. But after a while, I began to realize that I should focus on the plants that liked my soil and wanted to be here. So bloodroot, it's in the poppy family, if you know that early spring flower. Anemonella, I mentioned rue anemone in the chat at the beginning as being my favorite wildflower. In the spring, it definitely is. I think it's just the prettiest, delicate thing. Another reason rue anemone is one of my favorites is because it's one of the spring ephemerals that doesn't care that my soil is poor and acidic. It's become quite happy in dry shade and has seeded itself around in the front yard. In addition to being a member of the Native Plant Society, we became active with another group called the Friends of Plant Conservation. And this group is part of the Department of Agriculture, and they're charged with protecting all of the rare and endangered species in North Carolina. And the first outing that we actually went on with this group, we were down in Brunswick County collecting Venus flytrap seeds and replanting them. We'd found out not only are poachers coming after the mature Venus flytrap plants, but they would gather the seeds. So we were collecting seeds and trying to plant them further away from the roadsides. A few years after that, this is my husband, John, and the Cub Cadet on one of his favorite events ever. But we became volunteer stewards in Sampson County at a rare plant preserve, Pamlico Bay there. And it was seeing field ecologists doing restoration work that really made me begin to understand that what Sarah Stein had said, gardening is different from ecology. And we can have wildflower gardens, but it's never going to be exactly the same as the wild. We don't have those natural processes. Down in the coastal plain, most natural ecosystems had fire every year or so. Up here in the Piedmont, we had fire probably every 3 to 5 years. This picture up now is the same site where you just saw that smoking field and with John. That burn was in March, and this was that same area in July, just absolutely full of wildflowers, Rexia and Sebacia, just beautiful wildflowers. But none of those would have been there if it hadn't have been for fire. Trying to get the natives to spread and be happy in my woods. I'd like to burn my woods, but I don't quite have the resources to be able to afford to do it. But I've had to do some other things instead. For a long time, we let our leaves just pile up indefinitely. But a lot of the natives I was trying to get established in our woods weren't really reproducing. This little purple flower is not one that many people know. This is fern leaf scorpion weed. And it's really the only native biennial I know about. It's like foxglove. It makes a plant the first year and makes flowers the second year. But that plant really depends on reseeding, and I struggled to get it going. And then I reduced the leaf litter. I started creating some areas where I would let the leaf litter pile up, but other areas I keep the leaf litter minimal, a couple of inches. And these guys got happier. I mentioned that I have added bloodroot and trillium to our woods. Again, once I reduced the leaf litter, I started getting lots and lots of seedlings. And now most of these things are really reproducing and propagating themselves in the woods. That's one of my favorite pictures because it has bloodroot and trillium seedling, and you can see just how long it takes to get a blooming plant. A tiny single leaf is a trillium the first year, and then a couple of years later you get 3 leaves, and then maybe the year after that you start getting flowers. I hope you can see lots of little round bloodroot seedlings in that picture. I waited a long time to look out in spring and see a white carpet, and I'm just on the verge. Again, that's the woods with trillium. And another, this is this green and gold in this picture was green and gold that we rescued when they extended the road out to, if you've ever been to a hockey game in Raleigh or state game, the RBC Center, there was a beautiful patch of woods where that road is now, but some of those plants are now in our gardens. And this is our backyard. A little less wild than the backwoods, but still full of lots of natives. In the right-hand side is the thing that defines me as a coastal plains person. I think the fringe tree, Kyananthus, when I was growing up in Duplin County, that was just, everyone had one in their yard. You see it alongside the roadsides in wet places. And that was, in fact, the first plant that we planted here when we came. So that's, are we back? Can everyone, can we talk now? Carol?
I'm sorry, I'm just talking away and nobody can hear me. I don't see any other questions in the chat box. If everyone would like to turn on their video, raise your hand, we can ask in-person questions.
I'd love to see you all.
Yeah, let's let everybody's let's get into gallery so we can see each other. And if anyone has a question, if you could just raise your hand, we'll do our best to recognize you. I had a brief question about how densely you plant when you're putting in a bed. What are your thoughts about green mulch versus more traditional mulching?
More and more, we're trying to follow. I don't know if you've seen or read the book Planting for a Post-Wild World, but that is a book that's not so much focused on just natives, it's just sustainable landscapes. And density is really the key to that. Mulch has its own problems. And the more you can focus on ground covers, you know, the Native Plant Society put out I don't know if you've seen the brochure with the different native ground covers, but we try to start thinking now at the ground cover level. I was lucky here because the partridge berry was here, which at least in parts of our property just gave me that matrix of plants. In my front sunny border, I'm actually encouraging Carolina pony's foot, which if you have a lawn, you may think that's the worst weed you've ever seen because it's likes to put itself in lawns. But I'm finding that my perennials are pushing up through the pony's foot. But yeah, ground covers are the key to low maintenance. Absolutely. It's expensive. That's what I mean, from a designer's point of view, to try to sell a client on the fact that you need to invest all this money in ground covers is a little bit of a hard sell, because you're having to say you're going to spend a lot of money now, but save a lot of money in terms of mulch, in terms of weeding down the line.
Gail asks, let's see here. Name of ground cover brochure that you're mentioning.
If you go to the Native Plant Society website, there's a click where it directs you to several different brochures and handouts. I think there's a click or a link to it right on the first page of ncwildflower.org.
And Jim comments, dichondra is wonderful. I have so much volunteering in Raleigh.
Yeah, that's Carolina pony's foot. That's dichondra. Yeah, I agree. I love it. I'm actually transplanting it in a garden in the historic district. I wanted to put ground cover phlox as the front yard ground cover, and the historic committee disagreed with having a flowering ground cover. So I'm now transplanting dichondra into that space. And I put the phlox in the health strip because that's the right of way and they don't have any say over that. Phlox ground cover, the Phlox subulata, which, you know, covers Eastern North Carolina in the spring, at least it did when I was a girl, is just one of the great native ground covers to me for sun or part sun.
Excellent. Anyone else have questions? I'm not seeing any others in the chat. I know you use green and gold a good bit. Are there any other ground covers that you particularly like? I know you have partridge berry.
Yeah, and well, and there are two different kinds of green and gold. The green and gold that you saw pictures of in my woods is just the regular Chrysogonum virginianum. There is also a variation that's Austral, Australe, but there's a cultivar called Echo Lacquered Spider that shows up here in near us. Cure Nursery in Chatham County sells the Echo Lacquered Spider. And if you really, whereas the green and gold in my woods is beautiful and it clumps, you know, it's not a solid ground cover, but the Echo Lacquered Spider really makes a dense ground cover that other things can push through. I like all the native Carexes. You know, they're more higher, you know, they're not really, you can't walk through them like you can walk across phlox or something like that. But that's another good ground cover. And, you know, any plant that leaves a green rosette in the wintertime, you know, a lot of our natives don't just completely disappear. There's Stokes aster is a great plant to use as an edging along a path because it's there all winter long. Some of the asters at least leave a green rosette, something there that just occupies the space in the wintertime so the weeds can't move in.
Let's see, we have a question from Woody. What native plants are mosquito deterrents?
I have been told that beautyberry is a deterrent to mosquitoes, but that's the only one I know of.
And Beth asked, could you please touch on the extra things you can do for less work? She wasn't able to jot those down. And I had a question. I only have 2 pages for a handout, Dale. Was there supposed to be more? I've got the cover page, and then I've got the list of your plants, the ones that returned, the ones that are naturalized introductions. Were more pages intended for this handout?
Is there a list of references or resources?
Yeah, that's the first page.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think it's because it's made to fold like a little brochure. So
Gotcha.
The back is the resources and books and websites, and then the inside is just the plants that have returned. Those
good.
are
I wanted to make sure. So I guess Beth was just asking if you
come back.
if you could touch again on those things that you can do for less work. It started with increase the number and variety, I think, of native plants was your comment.
I mean, when we had more different types as we began to add, when we came, there were really was the canopy trees that had come back and non-native azaleas that all had lace bugs. There was nothing else here. As we began to add a lot of different plants, once we made that decision that we weren't going to spray anything anymore, we began to get a lot more diversity of insects, at least above ground. There's still no soil life in our soil, but that's one of the things. You know, not over irrigating is a way to decrease maintenance. You know, irrigation systems have to be maintained. Planting plants that can't survive in the circumstances that you have, is increasing your maintenance requirements. When you have to do a lot of watering, you're watering your good guys, but you're also watering the weeds. So you're going to have more weeds. Using ground covers instead of mulch, in the long run, that's lowering your maintenance. But I think mostly is being realistic about what your circumstances are and planting plants that really can thrive there. I mean, yes, you're probably going to have to water some things in the first 1 to 2 years. Mother Nature doesn't care if things die, but you're planting it. That's where, ecology and gardening are not the same. You don't want the plant you just spent all that money on to die. And so in the first year or so, you need to water it, but just the way you water. If you water things not very often, but deeply, you're encouraging plants to send down roots. And I learned that early on in working for other folks in their gardens, perennials that were near lawns that got watered every other day or every 2 days. When we went into water restrictions here, those perennials just croaked because they had never established, things that should have been able to withstand the drought just couldn't because they didn't have deep roots. So, trying not to have to irrigate and irrigating wisely when you do. And planting densely. That's, having a big, again, thinking about your plants. If you plant something that's big and aggressive and is going to spread a lot next to a delicate little treasure, you're creating a lot of maintenance because you're going to be pulling that out. And I learned that by planting obedient plant and bee balm in beds with other things. You can have those things, but by themselves. So that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, Gail has a question about water collection systems. Do you have water barrels, or what are your suggestions in regard to that?
We do have rain barrels, and we have, I think, 3 rain barrels on the corner of our 1,500 square foot house, so not a very big house. And those barrels fill up as soon as we get a 1/2 inch of rain. So that's, I think, one thing people don't realize is even if you have rain barrels, you're still going to have to be mindful of where your overflow for your rain barrel is, because it doesn't take very long. I've had one client put in a huge, well, actually 2 big cistern systems to capture rainwater, but that's very, very expensive. And it's big engineering. But rain barrels, do slow it down a little bit, and they give us water. We use our rain barrel water mainly to top up our little backyard garden pond, and I have a little fountain that has frogs in it, and our water is a private utility and has chlorine, so we can't use our regular water. But they're great, and you can use it for irrigation. If you don't have a pond you need to top up.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, and then it's getting close to 4 o'clock. We'll tie things up. Beth asked, how do you prepare ground for underneath established trees and shrubs without damaging what already exists? Do you do any prep, or do you just put the small plants in?
Well, it depends on your tree too, because some trees have much more shallow roots. I wouldn't want to do a lot of digging around a dogwood. Their roots are very close to the surface and delicate. Other things, you don't want to pile a lot of mulch. You don't want to bring in a lot of dirt and pile it up around your tree's roots. And so I would say gentle digging and minimal preparation, for planting things around trees and thinking about, we do plant under trees all the time, but try not to disturb the soil. We try to disturb the soil more and more as little as possible. because of everything that's been learned about the soil food web and everything we've tried to do to get anything alive in our soil here. But, you know, one thing is maybe just to go in and add a nice layer of mulch and before over the whole area, and then just, you know, small planting holes. We do use a product called Biotongue, which is a planting amendment organic fertilizer. And I think that gives the plants you're putting under the trees a little more of a chance to establish without doing big tilling or.
And do you just put that directly in the hole of the?
Yeah, just like what it says on the bag, just like it says on the bag. Yeah.
Okay. We have a question about fringe tree. With your knowledge of fringe tree, how would one do you think in a front yard, east facing, direct morning sun for 2 to 3 hours?
It would be so happy there. I mean, the thing about fringe trees, we have two, and one's a male and one's a female. And the male is in absolute full sun and it's big and rounded. It's the one you saw in the photograph. And then the other one is in the shade and it's this delicate sort of wispier thing. But fringe trees, they'll grow anywhere.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I did have just one more question, and then I think, oh, well, we have one more question here. Jim just says, I found that rain barrels are quite insignificant for 2/3 of an acre. For the maintenance to be worth it, I think 1,000 gallons plus makes sense.
Yeah.
And then I had just a question, Dale, about Swift Gardens. Is your property open to the public, and how does that work?
So we always have an open day sometime in September. It varies a little bit, and it's announced on our website. And usually the Read chapter announces it. I do a class in the spring. I should have been ready to plug that. I think it's April 2nd this year. But we do a class in the spring called Inviting Native Plants. And there's information about that on the website, and where we more or less walk around the yard and talk about all these plants that have come back. But that's the 2 times. We have some garden clubs. I mean, other groups contact us about coming for visits, and you know, we try to schedule when we can. Spring is busy, busy time with work, but yeah, we do try to. But those 2 times for sure, and then other times if a group wants to come, we can usually find a time.